Good afternoon, everyone. Just a welcome to everyone that's joined us for today's CST lockdown webinar. Thank you for signing on and for registering. We're very fortunate to have a wonderful presentation with us today of our two colleagues from the Centre for Complex Systems in Transition. We're an interdisciplinary centre in Stellenbosch in South Africa. We work on how to understand systemic change and transformation. For that, we use ideas from complexity thinking, systems thinking, but also social justice, transformation work, and a lot of sort of ideas that try to think about out-of-the-box ideas and methods for how to think about change and more resilient communities. So thank you very much for being with us. And we've decided to have the month of May, our lockdown webinar series, where every Thursday from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, we offer these webinars for insights on sort of ways in which complexity thinking can help us to understand our current situation in the world. And we've been, many of us, all of us who are working at the centre have been working on these ideas for the last 10 years or more. And we thought it'd be just nice to share with you how we try and make sense of what's happening in the world. And for that, we have with us today two colleagues from the centre. I welcome Nina Callaghan and Professor Mark Swilling. They'll shortly introduce themselves briefly just now, but I think the idea for this conversation also was born from the important work that they are doing in the sort of economic space at the moment, in governance space, but also having read their article that they wrote on the 30th of April that was published in the Daily Maverick, was titled Post-Covid-19 Crisis Pathways, Choices for Africa's Enduring Economic Recovery. And I think that was quite an important article, and the idea is that Nina and Mark share those ideas with us today and also give a chance to participants to ask some questions because I think that is probably the big question on everyone's mind, especially after last night's presidential address also. So let's start, and I'll ask Nina and Mark to just respectively introduce themselves shortly, and just to say what is the work that you are doing currently, and what is the work that you do at the CST. Thank you very much. Nina, would you like to go?
Thanks. My name is Nina Callaghan. My name is Nina Callaghan. I am a researcher at the Centre for Complex Systems in Transition. I work in the renewable energy space, looking at energy transitions, and also governance, looking at state capture and trying to find new gems and new angles to the conversation in that very important conversation. I'm also a student, so I don't have 10 years of complexity and sustainability thinking, but very enthusiastically composting all of those ideas to make sense of our world.
Thanks, Mark.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Swilling. I'm the co-director of the Centre for Complex Systems in Transition. My research is mainly on the dynamics of global and regional and local transitions. I've just published a book called The Age of Sustainability, Just Transitions in a Complex World. And my current research is really focused on the energy crisis and the dynamics of the energy transition.
Thank you. I think both Mark and I have given a really short introduction, but we'll also post your credentials afterwards in our when we upload the video to our website. But both Mark and Nina are people who are actually managing to as experts to be excellent, world-known scholars, but also activists. So this new sort of this mode of being in the world, and this is what is so exciting and inspirational about the work that they are doing, is not only are they scholars and experts in the theories and the methods and the ideas of how we study these transitions and different pathways, but they are also engaged with societal actors in many real ways to try and change the status quo of things. So Thank you very much also for leading in such an example. Nina, would you like to share maybe just a brief overview of the article that you've led in the Daily Maverick with us, and maybe just give us a little bit of an outline of your findings from the research that you've done?
Okay, thanks, Rika. Well, I think COVID-19 has really reshaped our ideas of being socially connected, economically entangled, and quite frankly, existentially unprepared for radical change. We're grappling with crazy levels of complexity. The search for security, I think, is often leading us into false dualities. And one of the strongest of those that has been expressed is the duality between economy and health. And this sees us pitting the logics of lockdown against the tenets of our current economic system, and trying to make sense of those apparent dualities, also within a context that we've expressed in a north versus south kind of way. So there's a lot of layers there as we're trying to make sense of things. What's becoming clearer, though, is that they're not trade-offs, but the economy and health are part of a coherent whole. And this is kind of a way for me to say that this presentation is not, well, my part, is not going to tackle our favorite topic of critiquing and analyzing lockdown. What's clearer to me is the need to understand health as having economic value and acknowledging that the economy is critical to maintaining health. Having lost millions of jobs in the process, just in South Africa alone, I haven't really been able to express those dualities or apparent dualities into any really coherent sense-making. That's going to add some more value to the conversation. So I'm also not unsure what to make of infection rates on the continent. The relatively low numbers that we've been recorded. Is it because we are 5 weeks behind other more impacted countries? Is it because of lockdown regimes, testing regimes? It's all very unclear to me, that part. And so maybe, Mark, you're going to be braver or clearer than I am. That's an invitation or a challenge, take it as you will. And also in this caveat, I acknowledge that Africa is not a country. Each country and each region on the continent has its own expertise, innovations, experience, human and economic capacities to deal with the pandemic. So if it sounds in the presentation like Africa is a country, I know it's not. And there's also some instances needs for generalizations. So just to get to the presentation proper, I am going to share my screen with you. Okay. And this research really tries to understand what kind of structural vulnerabilities exist in African economies. And it also asks what kind of approaches could have us emerge and prosper post-COVID crisis. To this end, I will briefly cover Africa's relationship with China, country vulnerability indicators, so we can understand how some of the modeling is done to arrive at those very gloomy economic scenarios. A brief look at debt crisis in Africa and social protection buffers and regionalization in a global economy. So we start with China, where the novel coronavirus is believed to have originated. It was the first epicenter of the viral outbreak, recording up to 83,000 cases and 4,500 deaths. China's severe, almost 3-month lockdown has had a crippling effect in many African countries before infections even registered on the graph in those countries. And we acknowledge in that China is Africa's biggest trading partner since 2009, having overtaken the US. So besides the vulnerability of having a primary trade partner, the nature of Chinese investment on the continent is also what makes Africa vulnerable and less resilient in a crisis like this. China's investment, or let's call it lending, because in most cases that's how it works. It's investment as project funding. All of that is directed towards China's national strategic objectives. Chinese investments in Africa is also sector concentrated, and that's mainly in the extraction of mineral resources and infrastructure projects. These projects are primarily serviced by Chinese labor. So Chinese investments in Africa create very few jobs. Countries also accumulate infrastructure-induced debt, and they're unable to afford this. A case in point is Kenya. 80% of its Chinese-financed railway that runs from Mombasa to Nairobi has gone 4 times over budget, and it's costing the country upwards of 6% of its GDP. And Kenya is not alone in this. So if we were to be making wiser choices in how we engage with China, one of the ways is for the investment to move away from a primary focus on natural resources and infrastructure, and perhaps more on manufacturing, which is more labor intensive and has the possibility to create more jobs for African people. So what does that actually look like in terms of stuff? This is like a quantitative snapshot of what the import and export relationship with China looks like. Congo commodity exports is 70% of that country's GDP, and 50% of that goes to China. Africa's copper belt, that's Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Republic of Congo, as well as Zambia, produce the world's main sources of cobalt and rare minerals, of which China is the main consumer. Manganese, chrome, iron make up 2/3 of South Africa. And so we really get the picture of what that trade is in, and how much countries are dependent on these channels of trade. So we're all too familiar with figures that are churned out by economic models. And this slide is an attempt to look at a methodology. And it looks at some of the indicators that economists and social scientists use to determine Africa's vulnerability to COVID-19 and also to measure its resilience. And there's a mix here of indicators that are direct and indirect impacts of the virus on each country. And I've selected the 10 most used indicators. The most immediate and direct impact of coronavirus has been the number of reported confirmed cases, cancellation and reduction of travel, of air travel, travel bans from China, and restrictions of entry for Chinese citizens, as well as other partners and countries who are in the midst of the pandemic. So a major slowdown in China and in other major trade country partners will affect countries depending on their exposure. And the more a country trades and receives investment, tourists and migrants from China and from any other trade partner countries, the more those countries in Africa will be affected. So once these modelers churn and crunch all of these indicators, they've come up with a graph that shows countries least resilient to the COVID-19 pandemic. And economic resilience is really the ability of a country to do something about the shocks, whether it's a response in the health sector or in economic terms, like the ability to use fiscal or monetary stimuli. It was very interesting to note that the resilience kind of indicators or variables didn't include governance and how strong state institutions are to be able to be nimble to policy adjustments, to set direction, and to implement. So this graph shows that drawing from the earlier indicators shows that Ethiopia, Ghana, Sudan, Zambia, and Burundi are the 5 African countries least resilient to the economic impacts of COVID-19. And the reasons given is because they have less fiscal capacity to buffer the impacts, along with poor quality health systems and poor access to them. I must say I was a bit surprised about Ethiopia, and still really digging around in how all of those indicators come together. The countries that are named as the most economically exposed, which is different to resilient, is Angola, Republic of Congo, Sierra Leone, Lesotho, Kenya, and Zambia. And that's because of they're most economically exposed because of the level of exports, imports, and tourism with China. So as we saw in the indicators, debt is a big vulnerability indicator. This is a graph by the World Bank economists, and it shows the level of public debt in foreign currency and in domestic currency. And the share of public debt in foreign currency is larger in nearly half of African countries. And of course, this makes them even more vulnerable to sharp exchange rate fluctuations. If we look at South Africa, that's an interesting one. It's probably the closest to Eswatini, where we hold most of public debt in domestic currency. But the problem here, the thing that we don't see is that public debt is often held by foreign investors who also participate in local securities markets. And in a volatile market as we have, this could precipitate a sudden outflow, which would then depreciate the rand against other major currencies. The almost generous overtures of the G20 and IMF to freeze debt for a short time allows African countries to support the COVID-19 health response and also the private sector, especially small and medium-term enterprises, which economists say are much more likely to keep the wheels turning than big business. What's also important to note in the debt question is heavily indebted state-owned enterprises, especially those colored by corruption, that siphon away money from a generative economic cycle. And they squeeze the state purse for COVID-19 responses. Social justice activists in South Africa are calling for an annulment of debt, of loans that state-owned enterprises have incurred with international agencies, and that debt amounts to about $3 billion. Another important point to note about debt, which I think is not new to all of us, is the very punishing structures of how we repay these loans, what's called debt restructuring. And the IMF has a few options, vehicles available for financing and for relief. Some of them come with conditions and some of them don't. But we've already seen that 90 countries have applied to the IMF. So this isn't just an African problem. Debt is a problem across the world. So when the IMF, before the IMF releases this money, they have to ascertain whether a country's debt is sustainable or not. And that basically means their version of sustainability is, can you pay back the money? And they will put it through various kinds of models until it churns out, yes, this debt is sustainable. And the variable that often has to change the most is how a country decides to spend its own money. And these conditions is what translates to austerity for us. South Africa has a program of austerity, and that means slashing public funding, which is really crippling in a pandemic. And if we think about, we have so many more crises to face, this is a really frightening situation. Austerity also means less social protection. And on a continent where 85% of workers are employed in the informal sector, there needs to be some kind of buffer. And social protection is a form of buffer from lasting damage for vulnerable households, especially for loss of income, food shortages. And so many African states have ramped up their social protection programs. And most of it includes institutionalized cash transfers, food transfers, and public works programs. It's interesting to note that the stronger countries that deliver these kinds of social protection programs are in Southern Africa. Ethiopia, Rwanda, South Africa, Kenya, Lesotho, Namibia, Malawi, and Mozambique, and Mauritius have very strong social protection programs, and they are quite nimble in toggling between food responses, actual cash, and so that's the benefits of having institutionalized sources. The weaker countries where social welfare is not strong, it's not strong because it's often funded by international partners, and there are a few of those countries mentioned there. What is really interesting are some of the stats on the lower right is the percent of GDP that countries spend on social protection. And you can see where we fit on the scale of things, Mauritius being way ahead of us. We also need to think of health as social protection. Rwanda is always kind of touted as the darling of social protection in Africa, but I thought to mention two other countries who've really been shining a light, and that's Mauritius and Senegal. The standout one for me really is Senegal. They have the largest COVID-19 recovery rates on the African continent and the third largest in the world. And they're doing this on a health budget of around 6% of GDP, which compared to us, we're at 8% of GDP. They also have a tiered health insurance scheme, which provides free or affordable access to everyone. So you can walk into any community clinic and receive a COVID-19 test. And what makes Senegal stand out is their expert knowledge, organization, and strategy in dealing with other disease burdens like malaria, HIV and AIDS, Ebola, and pneumonia. So they bring to bear all of these expertise to really place themselves in that position of being having the largest COVID recovery rates on the continent. And then some of the ideas that are being touted as a good one, a more sustainable one, is looking at regionalization. And the African Continental Free Trade Agreement has been offered as one of those choices or approaches, especially when we consider that trade inside and between African countries is less than 6% of all continental trade. That's very underdeveloped. When we look at trade between European nations, that sits at 69%, and Asian trade that sits at 59%. So whether we think that's a good post-COVID or current COVID response, in any scenario, this dire situation really needs to be addressed and improved. What that means is dismantling trade barriers and taxes. It means investing in financial, digital, and value chain infrastructure. And the estimates of that is about 40 billion rand investment. What this does, though, is that it puts countries, states, leadership in the driving seat about what kind of direction they want to take. And it also could act as a shock absorber in a global recession, and make the continent a lot more attractive to outside investment. But this also means that we can't just pay lip service to inclusive and sustainable growth. And we need to think about it beyond preferential procurement and the ability to pay back loans. We need to be thinking about low carbon industries and energy, smart, innovative resource use, gender equity, agroecological farming, and urbanization trends. And those are absolutely critical if future generations are going to survive future crises. Thanks.
Thank you, Nina, for really in-depth analysis on the work that you've been doing. Really amazing figures coming out there. Thank you very much for sharing that work. Mark, I'd like to ask you whether you could maybe just explain some of these findings more generally in the context that you're working from. What has been, is there anything that's been unusual for you, or is this sort of what you've thought about, all the many years already, or is there something that's popping out here that was quite surprising to you? And what does this mean sort of going forward in a more general way? Just unmute, please.
The most significant impact of the COVID-19 crisis that I think we all know is now pretty obvious is that it has revealed and exposed underlying contradictions that had suffered from a kind of normalization and were regarded as just a kind of fact of life rather than a policy priority. And across the African continent, this becomes clear as you go from country to country, but especially in South Africa, where we have the highest levels of inequality. I think the second thing that really has struck me as the lockdown has continued here and partially in other countries, and also speaking to colleagues in other countries in Africa, is the way in which the African continent kind of downloaded a template for how to respond. And I often ask myself, if the coronavirus had only affected South Africa and nowhere else, forcing us to actually look at our context and ask what's the best way to respond, would we have responded in the same way? And to what extent were our responses shaped by a kind of global herd mentality to kind of make sure that when you pitch up at the next World Economic Forum in January, you're not laughed at. You are seen as a respectable member of a community that prides itself as actually sharing information and copying best practices. But I wonder to what extent we would have, in African countries, come to the same conclusions that we have, especially when we weigh up the health and economic impacts. So if 1 million or 2 people are going to lose their jobs in South Africa, in order to mitigate the health impacts of a pandemic, and a lot of those people are going to suffer, and many could die in one way or another from various linked causes. Have we fully integrated the whole picture? And it's quite interesting if you look at the debate amongst economists in South Africa, which is pretty intense. There are basically 4 positions. The one position is best articulated by Haroon Borat from the University of Cape Town, who is a member of the Presidential Economic Advisory Committee, and basically he says health comes first, but we slowly have to reduce, reduce the lockdown and have an economic recovery plan, and the 500 billion Rand recovery plan is ambitious, it's good, it's hitting the right targets. And the opposite end of that is Duma Qubule, who basically says it's totally inadequate. This was a key opportunity to fundamentally restructure the economy. The Reserve Bank is asleep at the wheel. The fiscal stimulus is far too small, and a lot of the beneficiaries are the usual suspect anyway. So that's the other end of the spectrum. In the middle is the Institute for Economic Justice and Gilead Isaacs and Neil Coleman and a bunch of people associated with them, who are taking like a middle position, saying yes, the fiscal stimulus is too little. Miserly is the word that they use that in the recent article, but they are not throwing the baby out of the bathwater. They're somewhere in the middle, essentially arguing that there should be greater fiscal stimulus, but not pushing for some of the more radical positions that Duma Qubule and the People's Coalition economists are pushing for, like debt write-offs and so on. So I think that economic debate is interesting because it's moved the economic discussion away from kind of abstract modeling discussions about debt to GDP ratios and all of that to a discussion of the real economy, because all the debt to GDP ratios and all of those key indicators that were absolutely sacrosanct have all been, all those fuses have blown. And we way over what everybody said was going to be absolutely disastrous for the economy. So So I think that's quite interesting that this crisis, talking as an academic, does raise questions for how we now think about economic theory, economic policy. And we have people like Mariano Mazzucato, who's also on the Presidential Economic Advisory Committee, arguing at a global level that any support for business needs to be tightly hitched to conditionalities. Like, for example, you can't be in a tax haven. If you are, you don't qualify for any form of support, or there should be severe conditionalities around, for example, withdrawing from coal and oil. And I think that just links to my last point that within Carlos Lopez was recently interviewed, and the interview was published in the syndicate, also called the Project Syndicate. His essential argument is that the collapse of the oil prices, the withdrawal of the biggest investors in the world from coal, is actually setting up a context whereby African governments, when they consider their economic recovery, the best thing they can do is tie that to a Green New Deal, or in particular investments in renewable energy. So there is an interesting debate about investments in renewable energy now. The one is, because of the impact of the crisis, there's less money to go around, so that's going to result in a reduced investments in renewable energy, along with reduced investments in everything else. But on the other hand, an emphasis on the role of investments in renewable energy in particular as a key leading cutting-edge vanguard of the economic recovery. And certainly my own work in the South African context does suggest that, and the interviews that were granted by the 4 interviews published by the CEO of Eskom, Andre de Ruyter, over the last couple of weeks, where he's saying what no Eskom CEO has ever said, which is there is no option. You have to go, you need an energy transition to renewables. So I think this whole question of the economic recovery and the role renewables plays in that, and how that changes global investment patterns is really important, because there's a buildup of cash in all the energy funds as they withdraw from oil and coal, and they have to go somewhere. And that's where the question of renewables becomes important. And that's dependent on policy and regulatory frameworks. And in South Africa, policy is kind of okay, but the regulatory framework is just completely inappropriate.
Thank you for that. It's amazing also to learn what things actually fit together, or how things are linked in a way that we haven't seen before. But I think it's really remarkable, like you said, that at this stage we see how the fault lines are being exposed, and what the hidden assumptions were that on which certain systems have survived for so many years. And it's amazing just to learn how you paint the picture and how you make the picture fit together. Thank you for that. I see we have at least one question that I can offer us along. I think this might go to Nina, but any of you are welcome to answer this. It's a question by David Lemaitre. Intra-African trade will need improved infrastructure. So how, as Nina mentioned, with that new sort of trade agreement, how can that be financed without incurring the debts created by the Chinese? Any one of you would like to answer that, Nina?
I think it's the way that it's how deals are structured with foreign geopolitical players, and the critique here is, where does the majority of the power lie, and where does the benefit lie? So it's not in principle creating debt with a contractor. because that's how things are going to happen if you don't have the money. But it's how that loan agreement is understood, entered into, and how it evolves. The quote price of a contract is hardly ever what it ends up being, but costing you 6% of GDP is suicide. And how do African nations enter into these agreements? What are the kinds of understandings of benefit for us who enter into these contracts? How do we compute that? How do we cost that? So I think it's about being more robust in our engagements with these kinds of contractors, with these kinds of geopolitical players as well. This isn't just a matter of finance, it's also a matter of political projects.
Yeah, just on that, I mean, drawing from my experience gained over the last couple of years from my position on the board of the DBSA, and what's interesting is that the growth in the amount of money that the DBSA lends into African countries, non-South African countries, is faster than the total amount of money being lent within South Africa. A couple of years ago, we did the study to find out what were the causes of the inadequate flow of investment into infrastructure. Is it because there are not enough projects? Is it because there's not enough money? Or is it about the capacity to spend? And the result of the study was actually there is sufficient funding and there's sufficient demand, obviously. But what is the real bottleneck is the capacity to formulate projects, what in the finance world is called project preparation capabilities. And project prep capabilities is a highly complex exercise, and you need very, very skilled people in well-functioning institutions in order to be able to manage the packaging and the allocation of capital on scale. And that is a big block. That is the biggest blockage on the African continent, capacity, and a very particular kind of capacity. So that's the one point I'd make. The other point I'd make is that the kind of cutting edge of this discussion now in many African countries, but in South Africa as well, is how you create a new family or new generation of institutions that blend public and private funding, what in the lingo is called blended finance vehicles. And the president in his SONA address in the beginning of 2019 announced the establishment of an infrastructure fund, which the Development Bank was then charged to set up. And what that is essentially a new institutional configuration which would blend public and private funding to direct into large-scale infrastructure projects. And there's similar kinds of initiatives, and Rwanda's done very similar things for a while. And I think that's really where one needs to look, because following the economic theory of Mariana Mazzucato, the role of the public sector is to reduce risk by overall risk by taking the most risky investments and blending those with private sector investments that require lower risk profiles. And how do you bring these together so that you can maximize? Again, those kinds of institutions are going to have to invest very, very heavily in project prep capabilities, and grant funding actually will be required to actually build those project prep capabilities, because you can't, if you have to fund them out of the deals that get made, you don't have enough money to build those capabilities quickly enough.
Thank you. I think that's quite a deep insight. So it seems that there's a kind of a new thinking and skill building, like you say. Also, it comes out in the article that you published that these conditions, that some of the conditions that should be put out, for stimulating new, the recovery, the road to recovery, is this idea that there has to be some kind of link between regulation and incentives, and that both these sort of, and policy, and that these sort of regulation, incentives, and policy making should include sort of skills, training people in certain kinds of skills, and I would say live in some kind of new collaboration, between public and private partnerships. And I think that is also what's coming out in some of the readings that I've done to try and understand why is some places like Singapore or South Korea, so that they're coming out in this in such a different way. And I think they are sort of more interesting comparisons to be made between the way in which they structure their economical private-public partnerships and incentives. We have another question. It's by John Gerard Clark. How can we use the crisis to promote deep adaptation to the larger crisis, which is the global climate change crisis? How can we get the message across that our economy did not reverence life anyway, and now that we face an opportunity to reboot for a real to get a new system going? I think that's probably a question that's on top of most progressive minds at the moment, is can we use this crisis to press restart or reboot somehow? I've also spoken to people who said that the economy isn't really going anywhere, it's just hibernating, so a restart is not possible. But what if your findings be, or what is your intuitions and the discussions that you've been having? How does this COVID crisis and our response to that, can it be leveraged, to use that language, to restart something different in relation to the global climate change crisis that might loom ahead?
I think I have a small part of a response, is to say that our current economic system is a financialized economic system where value is kind of the snake eating its tail around finances and money making money. And nowhere in that cycle do we value or invest in people and labor, and what Mark refers to value in the real economy, which is building capacity, education. But I think when we look at all kinds of systems that we participate in and somehow uphold, what are the places where we are complicit or benefit from financialized systems or shareholder systems? It means that our distribution of wealth is going to change completely. If we abandon shareholder culture and invest in more real things that generate real value. And I know that we're always asking the question, can we press reset? But we're very much part of the reset. We're very much part of the reset. And it's going to cost us all in different ways, I think.
Yeah, I mean, my take on this, and I mean, a couple of people across the ideological spectrum, from Arundhati Roy through to Mark Carney, have basically all more or less said the same thing, which is this pandemic is really a kind of dry run for the big crisis, the climate crisis. And so what can we learn from the responses to this pandemic? Just incidentally, the notion that this was a black swan really doesn't. I mean, a black swan is something you never predicted. I mean, Rika, you probably can help here. But this, people have been predicting pandemic for quite a while. And the same of climate change. Climate change definitely not a black swan. I mean, it's a massive black cloud that's been gathering on the horizon and screaming down on us for decades. But it's starting to really have impacts. So I think the key lesson that we can learn from the COVID-19 crisis is the way in which, in a crisis, almost unthinkingly, we return to a respect for the state. And although we have lived in the shadow of an economic theory for a couple of decades that equates the production of value only with the private sector, and the public sector is really just seen as an enabler of the market and not a generator of value. So investment in R&D is not seen as generating value. Taking risk, reducing risk in the early phases of an innovation cycle in a range of businesses is not seen as adding value. It's just seen as enabling. And that is really at the heart of our failure to build viable states. If you tell a whole bunch of people, if you want to attract really good people into a set of institutions which don't add value, public value, I mean, you're not going to attract the best people. And so I think what this crisis is doing is finally forcing us to face the realities of the state and state institutions and how we rethink them. And that is key for dealing with the climate crisis. So the sustainability transition and which is the kind of the wider challenge, which includes biodiversity, which was part of the question, is we're facing these challenges in an increasingly complex world as we build information systems to algorithmically manage the nodal intersections of this complex world. And in that complex world, we say, okay, we need more directionality in order to tackle the challenges of human civilization and the planetary crisis. We need directionality, and for that we need states. But how do you bring the state back into a world that has become almost too complex? And so reconciling complexity and directionality lies at the very, very heart of the reconstruction of economic and governance theory in order to deal with the climate crisis. And that, in my own work in the book that I've just published, I have a whole chapter on the concept of collaboration, which is really about the emergence of a new set of institutions around the world where the core competency is facilitation. So the competencies within states have been things like regulation, policymaking, coercion, etc., but not facilitation. But there's a new set of institutions emerging around the world whose core competency is facilitation of a multiplicity of different kinds of partnerships to give direction. So you have directionality without necessarily having to reduce complexity. And a good example in South Africa is the Economic Development Partnership in Cape Town, based in Cape Town, run by Andrew Boraine. 25 people whose sole job is facilitation, publicly funded. And they were absolutely key in addressing the water crisis in Cape Town a few years back. So I think my answer to the question is a bit academic rather than policy oriented, but I think the policy issues are rooted in deeper underlying conceptual inconsistencies and problems which the current crisis is revealing. And it's really, really interesting. You know, just like the 2008 crisis resulted in nationalizations to save the economy, this crisis, which is not a financial crisis yet, is resulting in the re-entry of the state as a key player in protection of society. And that same cycle is going to play itself out as we deal with the climate crisis. Sorry, that was a bit long.
Good. That was great. Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Mark. Yeah, I think that was the question that probably that we're working on for such a long time is how to see how these things are connected, and what are the different kinds of ways forward. We have about 4 minutes left. We have one last question, which is about, is this the end of our thinking of growth as an economic indicator? But I think you have done a lot of work on that already. But maybe if you would have to sort of leave the audience with a last idea, I was thinking maybe to ask you a question, and you could maybe include the idea of growth, or if you want it in that or not, just to maybe to go out on a kind of hopeful note. In your work that you've done, or in the conversations that you've had, or the readings that you've done for what you're currently doing, was there something is there some kind of positive unintended consequence apart from the bigger things that are being revealed through the crisis? Maybe something more specific, something that you've come across that was like a profound wow kind of thing that struck you, or is that a kind of an off-ball question to ask? But it'd be interesting just to see would there be something like that just struck you as something unintended but positive, and that you would like to carry with you?
I think for me, Rika, what was interesting was the resounding call across the world for increased social protection. Mm-hmm. That was always the bleat from activist circles only. Only crazy activists would talk about the universal basic income. Only crazy lefties would be investing in pushing these ideas and making them real. And suddenly they're a very central part of a conversation around how we sustain ourselves, how food and labor is an economic value, and how we actually, never mind the bloody shareholders, we can't survive and we can't participate when we're without some form of income. We can't buy and grow food. We can't sustain our family. So I think that has been really interesting to see how that conversation has shifted out of a kind of far left quadrant and come full center, and it's really encouraging the ways that it's gaining traction, and how there are possibilities for certain kinds of responses, which for now looks like helicopter money, like monetary responses, which is basically just printing money. It's not actually financed. If that were to become institutionalized, it would need to be part of a fiscal response, which governments would need to commit to. And I think that's a really interesting conversation.
Thanks, Nina. Mark, last word.
Well, in my book that I just published, I use the concept of polycrisis, which is the idea of a nested set of crises within each other. And if you would have said to me at any point in the last 10 years that the oil price would go negative, I would say, it's just you must be insane. I mean, it's like, how's that possible? And so I think this issue of the weakening of an unsustainable system, mm-hmm. and the increasingly widely accepted view that there's no return to normal, because normal was unsustainable and was abnormal. I find that very, very, very hopeful.
Great. Thank you very much to our two presenters. It was wonderful to draw from your very deep and insightful work that you've been doing. I know that you're doing many things on the side as well with disinformation and all other kinds of wonderful revolutions that we'll see pop up soon, I'm sure. Thank you for the hard work that you're putting in also in this time. I know that you've just come out of many days of workshops and leading and facilitating difficult conversations. Thank you for giving your time to us, for sharing your insights with us. I really appreciate that. Just for everyone else, the video will be available online next week on the CST website, if you wanted to share this or just to re-listen to it. And some of the links will also be available on the website and the work that Nina and Mark are doing. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again next week, Thursday at 1:00. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rika.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Nina.